Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. There are quite a number of issues in society that up till, for want of a proverbial expression, up till about 5 minutes ago, most people in the West and in the world understood logically were either absurd or wrong. And yet today we're being sold a narrative that the United States population is completely polarized and split down the middle. The belief is that half of our fellow citizens hold views that only yesterday everyone considered absurd or objectively morally questionable. And we're being told that we ought to be afraid if we're not part of the new progressivist enlightened worldview. Joining me to have a conversation about this is Jonathan Butcher, the Will Skillman Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation and author of The Polarization Myth, America's Surprising Consensus on Race, School, and Sex. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Great to be with you. Thank you.
I'm very glad to be able to speak with you about this. And I want to begin by, you do a good job in the book of talking about how we got here. But even before we discuss that, we're being sold the narrative that the United States populace is genuinely split down the middle, polarized, or at least the experts are telling us this. I invite your wisdom here.
Sure, especially coming out of the COVID pandemic, there was this idea that there's a set of experts who know better than the rest of us about what is good for our health, how our schools should be run, whether or not kids are going to be safe at school with the pandemic, whether or not we should suspend students from school when they misbehave, whether or not boys should participate in girls' sports. I mean, we can think of all these cultural questions that came up really over the last 5 or 6 years, and we were made to think that there was some sort of expert class in the media or colleges who knew what was best, and that we should be following what the experts were saying. But when in fact, it's not true. As we've learned, especially now, when it comes to, say, boys having access to girls' private spaces, it's not safe for women when we allow men to have access to their locker rooms or bathrooms, right, or play on a girls' sports team. In the survey in my book, I actually found that the public knows this and agrees. We don't want boys on girls' sports teams. We don't want racial preferences used in college admissions. And there are a number of other cultural questions that don't actually divide us. We actually have a pretty solid majority on a lot of these questions.
Can you share with us what surveyors call, rightly, the success sequence, and how there actually is more of a consensus on the reality of the success sequence than we're being sold a narrative of?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So about 20-some years ago, social scientists at Brookings, in particular Ron Haskins and Isabel Sawhill, realized that there were 3 things that people who were not living in poverty had in common. If you finish high school, pursue college or enter the workforce immediately following, and get married before you have children, you are far less likely to wind up in poverty. In fact, by your mid-30s, you even reach, many of them even reached middle class. And this finding has held up over the last, especially 10 to 15 years, as researchers have over and over again looked to see if these indicators are true. So in my survey, I asked families, and I asked the general public, do you want young people at age-appropriate levels, right? So we're talking, upper middle school right into high school. Do you want them taught just the idea that you should finish high school, pursue college or enter the workforce, and get married before you have children? Should we at least tell young people that this will promote their lifelong success? And the answer was yes, across the board. The general public, parents, even a small sample that wasn't representative, but a small sample of school board members agreed. We should be teaching young people what the success sequence is, and that it matters for their life outcomes.
Knowing this, knowing the clear consensus with, I'd say, minority extreme opinions to the contrary, why don't we?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that anyone who's followed the news over recent years recognizes the power of teacher unions in directing school curriculum. Groups such as the National School Boards Association, others that have effectively said we don't want parents involved, right, in school curriculum, and students have brought home, during COVID and beyond, homework assignments and instructional material that's full of racial preferences and this idea that gender, right, is a construct. All of these things that parents have shown objection to, and I think the evidence is that there are interest groups that have pretty radical progressive ideas that they have put into classroom instruction. Because remember, if you're a teacher and you're going to prepare for your classes, there are some, right, who are going to turn to, say, the curriculum that's handed down from the school board, but there are quite a few, actually, that are going to look online and sometimes use the resources from the teacher union. The National Education Association, which is the largest in the country, the AFT, the American Federation for Teachers, the second largest, they both have resources that they push the 1619 Project, which says that America's founding ideals were false when they were written. They promote Black Lives Matter at schools, Week of Action, right? They push the idea that you can choose to be a boy or a girl depending on your choice that day. So, all of these things are being pushed by some pretty well-funded interest groups.
Yeah, I want to be the first to say, as a Black minority immigrant to this nation, it is abhorrent to me that such fallacious narratives are being taught about the history of the United States. And in particular, therefore, as you've mentioned, the success sequence, I want to ask you, now, I've lived in multiple nations before I got here too, so I have a contextual understanding of the blessing that we have here, both in our founding and in the way our Constitution is structured for the nation to run. So I invite you to speak to the necessity of a proper education in civics as going hand in hand with a proper induction into the success sequence for students.
Yeah, that's another great point, and it's another question that I asked in my survey. I asked families, do you want the civics taught more in schools? And 57% of my respondents said yes, they do want civics taught more. Now, it's interesting because this issue is actually a bipartisan one. There are those on the left and the right that believe that civics should be taught more. The issue is that there's a different version of civics depending on which side of the ideological divide you happen to be sitting. Those on the left, I think, can trace some of their ideas back at least as far as the Obama administration, where they pushed for what is known as action civics, the idea that we should kind of skip over the names and dates and go straight to the ideas and train students to be activists, right? Train them to be protesting, whether it's supposed climate change, whether it's plastic bags at grocery stores, whether it's some idea of gentrification. Teach them to go and be lobbyists, right? Instead of actually giving them the knowledge and foundations to understand where these ideas come from, to understand that policy is really a matter of trade-offs, right? I mean, there are certainly policies that are better than others, but even so, in a nation as diverse as the United States, there are a lot of trade-offs that have to be made, and we have to be able to prioritize what is best for the individual, the family, the community, as we design public policy. And that, I believe, is what a constructive civics education is all about. It has to hold fast to our founding ideals. It has to hold fast to the understanding that our representative system is a self-correcting system. We can talk about slavery as being abhorrent, as being something that conflicts with our fundamental values. And teaching that lesson doesn't mean that America is irredeemable.
Amen. Amen. My guest is Jonathan Butcher. He is the Will Skillman Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and we're talking about his newest book, The Polarization Myth. The fundamental premise here is that we've been sold a narrative that those who hold what one would consider socially conservative, biblically conservative positions are diametrically at odds with the rest of the United States, but Jonathan proves otherwise. We'll talk on the other side. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. Marcus Peter talking with Jonathan Butcher, Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, author of The Polarization Myth, America's Surprising Consensus on Race, Schools, and Sex. Jonathan, one of the things that you highlighted earlier, and given that you left us with that powerful truth, I want to ask you to just exposit that because it's so important that we reclaim this. The founding ideals, principles, and the framework that was written in the Constitution paved the way for the eradication of virtually every injustice against the human person. Sure, not every injustice could be rectified at the moment of the founding, but because the wheels were set in motion, so to speak, we had eventually the Civil War. And that paved the way for the kind of equality of opportunity that we have today. So share with us about the beauty and truth of that, but also why it's necessary to induct children into that context of a civics understanding of the United States.
Well, sure, because those that say that just because America had chattel slavery at one point in its history doesn't mean that the future of the United States is dark, or that the American dream will be unavailable, to all. You forget that there were those as early as the time of the American Revolution who opposed slavery, including Benjamin Franklin, who was an early leader of the abolitionist movement. There were states in the North, of course, that did away with slavery, and it ultimately, as we know, led to a civil war. But it's just the very idea that you had a nation created out of whole cloth, right? I mean, built on top of a lot of great ideas, but it was formed as a new, representative system. It decided, we decided for ourselves that we would, in some parts of this nation, do away with slavery, and then ultimately do away with it entirely. That doesn't excuse, right, anyone, but it does show that because our nation allowed for careful deliberation on the issues, it created a path, like you said, to eventually doing away with it. And I think that's a powerful statement about the value of being centered on a constitution that itself is based on the idea that it is government's job to protect our natural rights. And as you said, that is important for students to understand, right? That shapes their perspective very differently than saying that America is systemically racist and that the system must be destroyed and rebuilt with some sort of equality in mind, where some people have more benefits than others.
Which is critical theory drivel that history has shown to never work in the favor of human beings. But that's a conversation for another time, I guess. I want to therefore ask you, given that we just passed the celebration of our semi-quincentennial, and reading your book too, I get the sense that you would agree with this sentiment. Would it be safe to say that the average American today not only is not learned enough in our founding documents and the ideas of our founders, but we therefore lack the appreciative immersion in what they stake their lives, their reputations, and their honor and property for?
Well, that's right. As you look at the surveys that ask people questions about what they know about our Constitution, about the First Amendment, about how our government works, the three branches of our government, we find there is widespread ignorance, right, on these very important issues. And it's been that way for a long time. I mean, the Annenberg survey out of UPenn has proved this. There are a number of organizations that have surveyed adults and found that their knowledge of history and civics is either not much better and in some cases worse than students in grade school or in high school. So I think we need, for one, a revitalization of the concept of knowledge. Knowledge matters. Information in school matters. We cannot be satisfied to just teach skills. And this is a huge educational concept, that schools are focused too much on just teaching how to read instead of helping students understand what is important to read. And that matters because as students move into high school, they should be coming with a foundational set of knowledge that they can then apply to even deeper levels of understanding of these pretty complex topics around individual rights.
To narrow down the focus to some of the other issues that you've rightly highlighted that lends credence to what you just shared too, because of the reality that we've deviated so far from the worldview of the founders, which can arguably be described as a Judeo-Christian natural law worldview, we've also, for example, there really is a consensus in the American populace, as you've demonstrated, for sexually graphic materials to not be to not allow children to be exposed to those things, and that there is a desire for the teachers' unions to not have as ubiquitous a force in the formation of children as we're being led to believe many want. I invite you to speak to those things.
Well, it turns out that surveys find parents do not want sexually explicit materials on school library shelves. That is an unpopular idea. They do want, and my survey found, that it should be a collaborative process between teachers, school board members, and parents over what is in a school library or what is in a classroom on the shelf for students to have access to. And this doesn't mean that we're banning books. It actually is the responsibility of adults to decide what is age appropriate for students to be exposed to. It's not a complicated idea, right? The left will say, if you don't allow this in a school library or if you take it out, you're banning the book. That's nonsense, right? You can go down the street and get it from the public library or buy it at Barnes & Noble or order it from Amazon, right? I mean, if you want to have that in your home, that's what parents can choose. But in a public school, this is a deliberative process. It should be an example of how representative government works. As for unions, remember that teachers' unions are responsible in part for the creation of the U.S. Department of Education. It was the NEA's support of Jimmy Carter's candidacy that moved him to create this cabinet-level agency back in 1979, 1980. And now, fortunately, there is a significant move to close that bureaucracy. And that's important, right? Education is best handled at the level closest to the students. And teachers should be empowered to make decisions over the students in their class, and parents over their children over how and where they learn.
Given that, and your book highlights this, there's been a tremendous loss across the board for anywhere from public interest groups to simple public institutions that at one point were taken for granted to be trustworthy in social operation, and in this case, the formation of children. I invite you to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, look, there was a time when unions, especially even teacher unions, were valuable to teachers because they had no representation and their working conditions were not to their benefit. But the fact is now that teacher unions spend a very small fraction, we're talking 10% or less, of their budget on working conditions for their members. Everything else, we're talking 85+% of their budgets are used for political causes, either funding left-of-center organizations, directing it to campaigns of left-of-center candidates. These are funding organizations for the progressive left. They are not dealing with teachers' workplaces. So that's one, and that's a big one. I think, too, that we're seeing school board members who speak up in favor of the United States are being shouted down. In some cases, and I highlight one in Virginia, they're being kicked off the school board. So I think that we need to have a diversity of voices, in particular voices that are standing up for our founding ideals on state school boards and local school boards.
To revisit, therefore, the question or at least the point you made earlier about equality of outcome and the flattening of all distinction, which is a very overt application of a critical social theory. Can you please speak to what the genius of the founding is in terms of equality of opportunity and therefore liberty, allowing for a diversity of outcome, and that's a good thing for the nation?
Right, because when we think of free markets, we have to remember that by its very nature, it does not mean that everyone is going to wind up with the same thing. The only kind of government that's ever guaranteed that you wind up with the same thing is tyranny, right? And the same thing that everyone gets is misery, right? And I think the free market system allows people to change their status, which is significant, right? I mean, that's a huge difference from a tyrannical or centralized form of government. I think the genius in the founding was recognizing that individuals and individual incentives, when government removes obstacles from their way, they can climb the ladder of success, either with education, with hard work, and change their societal status. And that is a part of the beauty of the American system. That is, in effect, right, that is the American dream. And I think what education needs to get back to is being focused on helping students get to the American dream instead of instilling them with some sort of revolutionary desire to undo the system in which they're living.
If anyone's a good student of history, too, we should know, quoting Theodore Roosevelt, that revolutions are to be kept at bay. We shouldn't be desiring them. And so the fact that this one worked and worked well for the flourishing of human persons is simply a gift of providence. Jonathan, thank you very much for your book, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
My guest has been Jonathan Butcher. He is the Will Skillman Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. We've been talking about his book, The Polarization Myth, America's Surprising Consensus on Race, Schools, and Sex. And as a result of the surveys that Jonathan has conducted, it's become very clear that the purported divide between the American populace is overstated, that there actually is consensus across the board, and so we can discern our social operations and living accordingly. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.